If you haven't gotten the message by now, we're in the season of Advent, and I'm reminded of what the great church scholar and pastor from the 20th century, Karl Barth, said. He wrote in his giant book, The Church Dogmatics, he said, "What other season will the church have but that of Advent?" What other season will the church have but that of Advent? Yes, Advent is a literal time of 4 weeks on the calendar every year when we prepare ourselves for the joy of Christmas, and then we also prepare ourselves for the even greater joy of God's return and the restoration of all things in perfect harmony. Yes, that's part of the story of Advent, but it's not just 4 weeks on a calendar. Advent is also a posture, or it's a spirit that the church is called to embrace and to share in the midst of a world that is stuck in the tension between the present sufferings and pain we all experience and the future promises that God has made to us that pain and suffering and evil will not be forever. Advent is this spirit of being caught in between the present suffering and the future promise. And Karl Barth is saying that's where the church always finds itself, not just for 4 weeks out of the year, but for every single day of our existence until God returns in glory. We are in Advent. We are waiting in hope. We do not lose heart or despair, but we practice patience and awareness and expectant embodied joy, peace, hope, and love. Friends, this is the season of Advent, and so we thought what better way to celebrate Advent this year than to revisit the United Methodist Church's document called The Social Principles. Now, this past summer, a group of folks who attend this worship service studied and talked about the social principles, and so we thought it'd be a great idea to incorporate some of those elements into our worship for the next 4 weeks. Because after all, the social principles is kind of a how-to guide for a people of Advent. It teaches us how to be followers of Christ in this day and age. With all the present sufferings and despair we might encounter, how do we point ahead and beyond to the hope that is not only in our future, but is breaking into our midst right here, right now? You can find the social principles if you just Google UMC social principles, but for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at the 4 different categories that kind of divide up this document. And if you haven't gotten the hint by now, the first category is about being in community with all of creation, not just with other people, but with the entire world and universe that God has made. And friends, I don't need to remind you that we find ourselves in a bit of difficulty when it comes to our world. That we've experienced the present suffering and pain and unease when we're trying to relate, if we're even trying to relate, to the plants and animals and the rest of the world around us. I'll give you an example. My backyard right now, I don't want you to look at it. It's a mess. Not only do I have weeds growing where there should be grass, but we've got this planter box that is supposed to hold flowering plants and vegetable plants, except we don't take good care of it, especially now that we have a 3-month-old. And so every day I look outside when I open the curtains on our sliding door, and I see a yard in devastation and desolation. You don't need to remind me about the present sufferings any more than telling me to open my eyes every morning and look outside. This planter box in particular is falling apart, being eaten by termites who have fallen with the rest of the world because they go after the thing I want to stabilize and preserve. And I let all the plants die over the summer as we got caught up in having a newborn enter into our household. Except there's these pepper plants that continue to persist. God knows how, but they survive and they thrive. Friends, this is just a small, maybe laughable example of how we are out of relationship with the world around us. Ellen Davis is a professor at Duke Divinity School, and she wrote a fantastic book called Getting Involved with God. And it's all about exploring themes of faith and discipleship through the Hebrew scriptures. And at the very end of the book, she has a theology of ecology chapter. And she talks about this. She says, our present ecological crisis that we face in our world is not a technological problem. It's a theological problem. We face all this brokenness in our world with our creation, not because we don't have the right tools or because the tools we had hurt the world. She says it's because we have a disordered relationship with our Creator. I don't need to remind you that you can look all around and see the effects that human beings have had on the world around us. The fact that we have to set up national parks to preserve parts of our world gives it all away. I have a friend who recently watched a documentary on Netflix called Buy Now. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's ranking in the top 10 on documentaries in Netflix. And it's all about this incessant materialism that affects our country and how when we are encouraged to buy things, we end up wasting things. And where does it end up? It ends up all around us in landfills and oceans, everywhere where we don't want to look is where it lives and resides. We have a disordered relationship with the world around us. And this materialism, it not only leads to consumerism, but it leads to industrial farming as we manipulate animals and plants and the world around us to try and create more and more, except we don't know how to share that well. And so some end up with a lot and the rest might starve. And then the world suffers. And Ellen Davis makes this point that she says there's always been an inherent connection between God's people and the people of the land. If you were here about 6 weeks ago when we first started our journey through the book of Ruth, you'll remember in chapter 1 that it begins like this. In the days of the judges, there was a famine in the land of the house of Judah. Now, the days of judges were not the glory days. Those were bad times for God's people. And what the author of Ruth is saying is that when things are not good for God's people, when they're not being the people that God calls them to be, the world suffers, not just the people. So in the days of the judges, there was a famine. Conversely, when people are living well and being faithful, the earth seems to flourish. There's a connection because as far as we believe, we think we're masters over the rest of creation. That's how we live, at least. As far as we can tell, we're put here to dominate, subjugate, manipulate the rest of the world for our own liking. But the scriptures tell a very different story. They don't talk about us being over the world, but they talk about us being part of the web of relationships that make up creation. Now, Christians for many, many centuries have used scripture to justify their dominance of creation. Right before Genesis 2, you get to Genesis 1, and 2 times in Genesis 1, God says, let us make mankind in our image, humanity in our image, and let them have dominion. Let them have rule over the rest of the world. And Ellen Davis points out that we have used this as kind of a free rein or a license to do whatever we want because we were given mastery. Well, that's why we read Genesis 2 this morning. It acts as a kind of counterbalance to the lofty aspirational vision that is in Genesis 1 of what human beings can be. Genesis 2 comes in and reminds us literally that we are made of dirt, that we are no better than the rest of the world around us, that we find ourselves naturally within the order of things. And that verse 15 that we read this morning, where the man, Adam, is put in charge of the garden to till it and to care for it, those 2 Hebrew verbs, to till and to care, are used hundreds of times in the Hebrew scriptures. Except most often they're not used and translated as to till and to keep. Those words actually better translate as to serve and to protect. Ellen Davis points out that those 2 Hebrew words, the one we translate to till, is better translated as to serve because it's often used in humanity's relationship toward God. That we are called to serve God. And so when the author of Genesis uses it in the context of humanity's role within creation, we are called to have a serving relationship toward the rest of the creatures around us. We're not called to be over them and to master and subjugate them as much as we're called to care for them. And the second Hebrew verb, which translates as to keep here in Genesis 2, might better be translated as to guard, to protect. This word is often used in the Hebrew scriptures when the people of God are called to protect those who are most vulnerable in their midst. The orphan, the widow, the foreigner. That word shamar means to guard, to look out for. And so here in Genesis 2, we might better translate it as in the relationship of creation, human beings are called to look out for its most vulnerable members. Not just other people, but plants and the world around us. Davis reminds us that we're called to have a relationship that's meant to be deferential, observant, and protective. And it's in this kind of relationship that we discover what the meaning is behind all of it. When we serve and have deference toward the world around us, when we look out for it, when we steward it well, rather than seek to have mastery over it, we find out that we all share a common source, which is our Creator, the God of the universe. There's a quote from John Wesley that I think we'll have on the screen here. John Wesley is the founder of the Methodist movement, of which Alamo Heights UMC is a descendant. And Wesley had this to say in one of his sermons about the Sermon on the Mount. Go back one a little bit. There you go. This is what Wesley said. God is in all things, and we are to see the Creator in the glass of every creature. We should use and look upon nothing as separate from God, who pervades and actuates the whole created frame and is, in a true sense, the soul of the universe. Friends, that's quoted in our social principles document, but that's reminding us that every time we take something from the earth, every time we reach out to an animal around us, every time we breathe in the air, we are reminded that we are part of the same fabric knitted together by the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. I was talking to Chris Estes, who's a pastor here of Recovery Ministries, and he was telling me a story about one time when he was hiking in Colorado. And he went up to a pine tree, and as Chris Estes' practice usually is, he stopped so he could listen to the tree. He does this whenever he hikes, and he encourages people to listen to the trees, to take a second, to be present, to pause. And Chris says that in this particular moment in Colorado, when he was listening to a pine tree, he had a revelation of sorts. He was reminded that as he breathes in oxygen, the tree is expelling oxygen. And as he breathes out carbon dioxide, the tree is inhaling, in a sense, that very same carbon dioxide. This reciprocal relationship of harmony that we both depend on mutually, he said, the atmosphere of which is God. I thought that was pretty profound stuff, particularly from Chris. We love Chris, and he's probably the smartest guy in the room most of the time, but that is profound. In a simple thing like that, which we all know, but do we really believe? That the air we breathe, we literally depend on from the rest of creation, and vice versa. That we are called to steward and be among, not over and against the rest of creation. I know all of it can seem quite overwhelming. When we look at the world around us and we feel like the momentum is going in one way and it's not a good direction, what are we called to do? I'll give you an example. And maybe this will help you, maybe it won't. But about a week ago, I was trying to distract my 3-month-old while my wife was getting some things together. So I took her outside to my backyard, of which I feel a lot of shame. And we went over to that one surviving pepper plant. And I started pointing out to her things like the leaves that were still green, the flowers that were beginning to bud, and yes, even some full-grown peppers that I found hanging off its branches. And I showed Caroline these plants, and I said, these plants provide us with some food that we use to cook and that we enjoy, and God lets us take care of them. And then I realized in the moment I was preaching this very same sermon to her, to this captive audience. It's a simple thing, but these little actions have deep significance because they open our eyes and make us more aware of the deeper realities in our midst. They not only make us aware, but they attune and align our lives to the current that is running throughout the entire universe, that grace of God upon which we live and are sustained. It's found even in simple things, like picking a pepper off a plant. How about that? Peter Piper. Picking a pepper off a plant and thanking God in the moment and showing someone else how it's done. Friends, these small actions, we might think they don't mean anything, but in our Christian tradition, we believe that small, simple things have deep mystical significance, just like communion and baptism. Yes, it's just bread and juice, or it's just water and words, but all these things have deep, deep, transcendent meaning as God works in and through them and in and through and with us. The story is told about 2,000 years ago of a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he was a contemporary of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's said that Yochanan ben Zakkai once said, if you're holding a tree sapling in your hand and you get word from a neighbor that the Messiah is here, first tend to and plant the sapling, then go and greet the Messiah. Now, a lot of folks believe that to mean that Zekkai's word is be patient. The Messiah might not yet be back. Don't get too excited. Tend to your daily tasks. But in that story, I see something even more significant. That the ministry God has given us as people made in God's image, tending to the world around us and stewarding it well, not only for ourselves, but for future generations of both humans and non-humans, that ministry is not opposed to the presence of God. That Yochanan ben Zakkai reminds us that it's in planting the sapling that we are holding in our hand that we are doing the work of the Messiah who is in our midst. It does not detract or take away from what God wants to do in this world. But when we plant, when we till, when we breathe, when we swim, all of these things, when we gather for a meal in just a few moments, we are tending to the ministry of the God who creates, who sustains, and who will redeem. So friends, in just a few moments, you're going to be invited forward as people of hope to have a literal piece of creation placed in your hands and to take it and dip it into juice. And as you receive these elements, trust, O people of God, that God can do more in this simple action than we could ever by ourselves. And believe that those promises that are made about the future are breaking into our midst right here, right now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.